Now I want to talk about risk factors that can cause or contribute to combat stress injuries. And again, think of the continuum. These things may contribute to a reaction rather than a disorder, but they can go all the way through the spectrum. So, talk about environmental risk factors. And the things in yellow are not different. I just highlighted them as things that are particularly damaging. So, greater combat intensity, duration, more deployments we talked about. Participating in or viewing atrocities. In every war there's been atrocities. Now we have, the news, which is so kind to point them out for us. So all of the detainee scandals, abuses, killing innocent people, murders, war crimes, things like that are atrocities. More people than you might imagine participate in those things. They don't report them because they would get in trouble. But if you think about the fog of war, the chaos and uncertainty that goes on in war, this is not an excuse, but sometimes people don't think about what they're doing at the time. And then they remember. It kind of all comes home to them later, and they think, how could I do such a thing? Handling or viewing remains, especially of comrades. Picking up body parts. When I was in Fallujah, there was a place we called the Potato Factory. It was up on the northern side of the city, and people were stationed there, and their sole purpose was to go out into the city of Fallujah. This was after the second battle in November, and pick up body parts. Because we don't leave anyone behind, right? We need to get everyone home. And it had been a few days at this point. So one way they looked, one way they realized they could find bodies, was to look for where the maggots were crawling around. So think about what that does to your psyche. Looking for body parts by looking at the parasites that are crawling on them. And what happens if you find someone that you know? What happens if you're working in mortuary affairs and someone comes across your table that you know? These are causes of traumatic injuries. And I don't mean to be gruesome, but I tell these stories, some of you have heard or seen them. Some of you may just think it's important to have the exposure. Poor communication, harsh weather, the anticipatory anxiety of knowing you could be ambushed, knowing you could be mortared, not knowing when these things are going to happen. Inadequate living conditions, because, let's face it, these are not the most luxurious countries in the world that we go to. Availability of substances to abuse. We got people getting in trouble, getting court-martialed in Iraq and Afghanistan for abusing substances. Sometimes they're just looking for sleeping pills that they get from the local nationals, find out later it was steroids or something. Not that sleeping pills would have been better. Operational and organizational risk factors are those things that are sort of built into the community, or built into the unit, built into the environment. Poor leadership, we don't like to think it exists, but everyone sometimes makes a bad decision. Unit morale can be low. And think of this as coming, outside the unit. When people retire or are separated and are in a workplace, morale can also be low. Might lead to one of those moral injuries. Unpredictable deployment schedule. We've all got that. For all I know, I could return to my desk today and find orders to Afghanistan for a year. We don't know. That uncertainty is very wearing. Ambiguous rules of engagement. Recently assigned personnel. Nice to go with people you train with. You trust them. They trust you. Everyone's kind of there to watch your back. When you have new folks, no matter how good they are, it takes a certain amount of time to develop that level of trust. When you're in a combat zone, that's a risk factor. Lack of home support for a mission. I have heard firsthand from patients who have still gotten spit on for being the, quote, baby killers that we used to call people in Vietnam. Not we, but society. That's extremely damaging. Talk about a moral injury. Equipment that's faulty. Communication that's faulty. Lack of confidence, lack of training with the specific equipment or with the job that you're doing. We've had guys go out there, guys and girls go out there doing jobs that they weren't trained for simply because we need the bodies to do those things. So we've had artillery units go out and provide convoy security. We've had clerks go out and provide, well, lots of convoy security. Suddenly people become medics. They learn how to do IVs. They learn how to take care of people. Things that they were not trained to do. That lends itself to vulnerability. Because you know people's lives are on the line. You want to be able to do things well. And if you haven't had the training, you don't have the experience, there's a lot of worry that goes in there that you may not be able to. Right? And then there's the individual. And I'm going to switch things up again. So individuals that are minorities, that are females, facing discrimination, and they may not be facing discrimination, but if they are, that's a risk factor. That's added stress. That's added worry. Lack of training and experience, we talked about. Pre-existing mental health disorders. We have lots of people deploying these days who are already taking antidepressants, medications for ADHD. They have histories of anxiety in their past. They have histories of other mood disorders. It's, I think, to our credit that we're able to deploy a lot of these people. However, there is a risk factor there. That all other things being equal, those people might be more predisposed to developing a post-traumatic stress disorder or a stress injury as a result of their experiences. Very young or very old. The Army is, I don't want to pick on the Army, but they're probably the worst culprit at deploying reservists who are in their 50s and 60s. And, you know, many of them are excellent soldiers, they do their jobs, however, they do have that as a risk factor. They have more medical concerns, they have less physical strength and endurance. Those things affect people out there in the combat zone. Single or divorced. People with a lack of social support, people that are kind of on their own. They don't have people to come home to, or they don't have people to support them while they're out there. Those people are at risk. Conflicting feelings about the mission, and this is what can lead to those moral injuries. The people that wonder, why are we there? You know, every best friend that I've had since I joined the Marine Corps has died. Why are we still there? Those kinds of questions. Homefront worries. Communication is great now. We have internet cafes everywhere. We have internet phones, satellite phones. The flip side of that is when you get to talk more to people at home, you get to hear about all the worries and all the things going wrong at home. And if you don't, then you wonder, well, what is my spouse going through? What is my family going through that they're not telling me? So there's added stress from that added communication. Becoming wounded or ill. That's another thing. Lots of people get concussions out there. It's why we call traumatic brain injury the signature wound of these wars. Most people don't get sent home from that. They get taken off the line for a few days to make sure they don't get another head injury in a short amount of time, because that's lethal. Could be. But they generally don't get sent home. But meanwhile, they've kind of, you know, had their bell rung, had their head knocked around a bit, may have some other injuries resulting from that event, and they're still responsible for fighting in a war. It's another risk factor. Now, as I said, most people do fine. Most people maintain themselves or are maintained by their friends in command in the green and yellow boxes. But there is a relatively small percentage of people that end up in orange or red. And these are the risk factors that can get them there. So I tell you these just to, if you get to talking with people and start hearing about risk factors, these are the things that should start kind of triggering your memory and thinking, okay, well, I understand this now. I understand these reactions that you're having.